But let's go before we get onto my personal data because I think it's important. Let's give let's use you as a professor teaching, and you're starting the 101 class on amyloids, histamine, lectins, phytic acid. Let's sort of give a frame there. We had Dr. Gundry on also talking about lectins on the show. So I think people just need to understand some terminology and why it's important.
Okay. So amyloids, what are amyloids? Well, there are two types of amyloids. There are endogenous, meaning they come from within, and then there are exogenous, coming from the environment. So our internal amyloid structure is an inflammatory response. So then the body goes, uh-oh, I need to counter the inflammation so I can come back to balance. Those are okay. But what's happened is, and this is the work of Senef, and I know Stephanie, I love her work, that the crowding conditions of our animals, the torturing of our animals, the feeding of antibiotics and steroids and glyphosate through the crops that they're eating has created in their tissue through the stress response these truncated protein structures, meaning they're indigestible or much less digestible in the tissues of these animals. The most studied are chicken and beef, but we can see it in pork and turkey as well. Why chicken? Because they're the most crowded. They have the shortest lifespan, and we know that generationally now DNA transfer. So it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And so when we consume these amyloids that are indigestible, and especially if we have genetic vulnerabilities to protein malabsorption, I have the A1298C of the methylation gene, which makes me less likely to break down protein. And then you couple it with glyphosate, which becomes a glycine analog, which says you can't break down protein because we're stealing. Your body thinks it's making it a glycine, so it doesn't need it anymore. And that's important for hydrochloric acid, which is important for digestion and digestive capacity. So now you've got two hits, right, to protein. And so we eat this, and what does that do? Well, it has a deleterious cascade effect. One, the clinical literature and my anecdotal evidence through my practice, it turns on viruses. It turns on pathogens, but particular viruses, the DNA amyloid fragments, the viruses living within us, take them, they're in our GI tract, and then they get reactivated. That's why Hashimoto's is through the roof. That's a reactivation of the Epstein-Barr virus. That's why MS is through the roof. That's a reactivation of varicella. Polycystic ovarian syndrome also has a varicella component. Bell's palsy, varicella component. Ulcerative colitis, varicella component. Heart disease, cytomegalovirus. Lung cancer, cytomegalovirus. These herpes family of viruses, I call them Rip Van Winkle being awakened because of the amyloid burden. Okay. So if we're not wild, if we are not consuming low amyloid burdened food, we're in trouble. And guess what? The spike protein also makes 7 vectors of amyloid genesis.
Sure.
So now you've got the spike protein and you've got the food supply that are contributing to amyloid genesis in our body, which guess what amyloids do? They also create plaques in the brain and the spinal cord. We recently had a gentleman who had MS with spinal cord lesions and brain lesions, and he was paraplegic. He went to the top neurologist in our country. They got him to walk with a walker, 38 years old. We figured out he had a reactivation of the varicella virus in his spinal cord. He's completely MS free, not just symptomatically, but the lesions are gone.
Wow. Well done, Teri. That's incredible. That's
Thank
incredible story.
Thank you. And it's because he was creating a feeder system. He was eating the wrong foods for his genetic vulnerabilities, and the environment of the pandemic was creating this amyloid cascade. And he also had sulfur and oxalates and mold. So he had the big, I call it the whole enchilada. But when we untangled that web for him, he's now completely well. He proselytizes this around the globe because
Sure.
he was only 38. His life was going to be changed for the rest of his life. And they told him 1 in 10 million that he might have this chance of improving, much less actually complete resolution.